Hey, it's ArtStewart from Strategic Impact Partners, and this is What Matters Most on LinkedIn and YouTube. And with me today is TimLeech, who is with Risk Oversight Solutions in Ontario. And we're talking about some of the challenges and opportunities facing boards and the subject of risk. Tim, good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Art.
Tim, you're well known in this area, and you've been looking at very intently recently some of the challenges and opportunities to do with the structure and the focus of boards. Maybe we should start with the basics. What do you see are the top challenges right now, given the very dynamic economic climate we're all operating in, that boards really need to be dealing with?
Well, probably, I think you've already alluded to it. Boards are struggling with the pace of change in the world, and this year is probably a good illustration, but the 2 years of COVID before it were also enormous periods of change. So, of course, boards have primary responsibility for guiding the organizations that they represent through these times. And a lot of my articles focus on my belief that traditional practices, board practices, audit practices, risk management practices are not up to the job of today's rate of change.
Well, you talk a lot about, some of the focus needs to be on, enterprise risk planning, right? Is that a good place where companies can start? Is it a case that some of the challenges that the board itself has to look at and reconfigure to properly address begin with what's going on with the operating entity in which they're governing? Is it like a grassroots up kind of movement, or is it both top down on the governance side and what's happening operationally with boots on the ground in the manufacturing or whatever the making of a company is, the making operation?
Well, I think as human beings, we fall into certain established ways of doing things, and it happens to us at a personal level, and it happens in companies. And historically, the strategic planning process at companies was mainly management driven. It would then be presented to the board. The board would ask some questions, and sometimes they would intervene, sometimes they wouldn't. But it's fair to say that the powerful institutional investors, particularly in the United States, are not happy with the board's engagement in that process. So they made it very clear, the BlackRocks of the world and the big pension funds, very heavy focus on pushing boards to be more engaged. Now, they're not doing that for no good reason.
Right.
They're doing that because they think boards have not done as much as they need to. So that's a key piece. We've also got this massive worldwide, we'll call it the ESG movement. What that is doing is pushing companies and boards to spend more time to really try and articulate what the company's purpose is. Is the purpose of the company solely to provide a return to shareholders who hold that stock at a point in time? Or is it something bigger? So this is an enormously confusing time for these companies. You're bringing in to play the fundamental, we'll call it morality or view of the role of companies versus society into play. Now, Europe has always had a different philosophy on that relative to the United States.
Yes, they
The
have.
UK and Canada kind of straddle in the middle, and the UK has been the most, we'll call it the strongest proponent of what is now called shareholder capitalism, which says, let's just focus on looking after our shareholders. We're not going to worry about the whole world and whether climate change is causing massive change and potential destruction of life as we know it. So these are difficult times. And if you're sitting on a board and You know, as I said, if you're a US board, it may be a little different than if you're a Belgian board.
Well, let me talk a little bit too. I mean, you mentioned you know, right, Larry Fink, for example, very out front, you know, among other companies and corporate leaders, trying to move the ESG framework forward. You know, what's been happening in Florida, pushback from the whole Disney controversy, and then the labeling of ESG practices by what I call the anti-ESG propagandists, which are, they are trafficking in misinformation. Nevertheless, it has people confused. And in some cases, because of the misinformation or just the lack of education, folks have assumed ESG is a woke kind of political agenda. And finally, in just the last few weeks, as those of us like you and I who operate in this space have recognized, some folks are standing up to defend ESG as it should be defended. And Larry Fink and others coming out now with statements clarifying the credibility of ESG practices as very viable for what investors are looking for as part of the outcomes of any due diligence process. You mentioned purpose. So is it your view that a board should be defining its purpose as a board that may differ from what a company that it's governing defines as its purpose, or what the brand purpose is?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I suppose my 2022 article in Ethical Boardroom, which is a very good publication published out of London, focused at board members. In it, I actually propose a purpose for boards. And I go on to say, it's my experience, having worked around the world and reviewed literally hundreds of board charters, the vast majority of boards in the world right now are what I call publicly purposeless. There's a lot of reasons for this, but if you go to the NACD site, NACD being the National Association of Corporate Directors, arguably the leading director institute in the world, because the Fortune 500, to the extent board members belong to professional institutes, it's probably going to be the NACD. I have tried. I can't find anywhere on there with any clarity the NACD lays out what they think the purpose of a board is. So this is the institute that represents directors, and did a pretty thorough job trying to find it. So they're in the process right now. They have convened a major commission, very blue chip people that have been appointed to be on it. Their pedigrees are incredibly impressive. The purpose of this commission is to study whether US board practices are outdated. So this year in Ethical Boardroom, I wrote an article that ended up, the editors chose the title, Spotlight on US Board Practices. This is my advice to that committee about what I think about US board practices. And the answer is yes, they are outdated, and they're seriously outdated.
Well, so how are they outdated? In a nutshell, what are the three things that you think are part of what characterizes them as being outdated? So what are those?
Well, not surprisingly, the first and foremost that I really pound on, and my technique in LinkedIn posts, you get 1,450 characters. Those are characters, not words, to get your point across. US boards, and many of the boards around the world, are publicly purposeless, meaning they don't tell the stakeholders why the board believes they exist. You'll see long lists. We're going to review the strategic plan. We're going to review this. We're going to review that. We're going to keep an eye on management compensation. So these lists might go on to 40, 50, or if you took the charters of every subcommittee, there might be 200 things they say they're going to do. But then you step back and say, where have they told me specifically what I can expect as a result of the board's existence? Why do they do those 200 things?
So, okay, so then what are the other two things? Because I've got a couple of questions around this.
Sure. So then in my submissions, I talk about the vast majority of companies have not agreed internally what are the most important, what I call strategic value creation objectives, and what are the top value preservation objectives.
Right.
So, of course, the strategic value creation comes from what's the purpose of the company. Now, a lot of companies don't have a clear purpose. It'll be something somebody wrote, but if the average person read it and you ask them, what does this mean? You're often at a loss to
And,
understand.
and it often doesn't articulate anything that any one of the stakeholder groups would identify as what has meaning to what their perception of the company is and what their purpose is.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And people like Elliot Schreiber, who wrote The Yin and Yang of Reputation Management, which is a very good book. I'd recommend it. It's a fairly long read, so you better be ready for
And
a
he
fairly.
and he is a friend of ours and has been on this series.
Absolutely. I conflict of interest. I wrote a foreword for it with the CEO, I think, of the NACD and a couple
Right.
of other incredibly pedigreed people. So your point about stakeholders, of course, the purpose of a company should give a clear reflection who the company believes their key stakeholders are and what it is they're going to do as a result of their existence that has some significance or value to those stakeholders. So that's key. So in addition to clarifying their purpose, but if you were to read the purpose that I propose for them, the purpose then says it pretty much paints what else needs to change. So institutional investors are not happy that boards are engaged enough in the clarity around company purpose or in the strategic plan. So my calls for change says, all right, every company in the world should define what are those top strategic value creation objectives and what are the top value preservation objectives. Value preservation objectives won't make you great, but if you don't achieve them, it will get you in a great deal of trouble. So complying with the laws, publishing financial statements, nobody's going to claim we're the best company in the world because we have incredible IT security. Somebody wants something else from the company other than that. And even having an incredible business continuity plan won't get your share price up.
Well, and also if you have some kind of cyber breach or some kind of unanticipated catastrophic event, those claims are going to be even more meaningless. I want to ask you this question in light of what you've just been saying about the lack of purpose and the lack of alignment between stakeholder understanding of what the entity's purpose is and what the board thinks the purpose of their governance role is and the company. We're hearing all of this chatter as well as very substantive efforts to get boards to reinvent how they go about and what they look for in recruiting new board directors. So if a board can't even figure out what its purpose is, that then reflects what the committee structure should look like and the strategic priorities, then how can they possibly properly respond to what changes they may need to make and who they look for, what type of individual qualifications, diversity profile, whatever, that they actually need to populate their board with that will better align with this new, more focused agenda.
Well, I think you brought up a great example. You're saying, okay, let's have a look at the way the board brings on new board members, decides which board members need to be counseled out or otherwise.
Well, I mean, part of the whole crux of the current ESG movement around DEI and B is the fact that all these boards, most of them, now public companies, I think, are doing better. There's an imbalance between not having enough diversity profiles holding board seats that not only represent the agenda of the brand or the company, but actually represent the orientation of the actual customers and community leaders and all the other stakeholder groups in which the company's success depends upon.
Yeah, you're right back though to the huge debate that's going on in the US about where are we going to land, we being each company in the United States, on the shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism continuum.
Right.
And but back to your point, my advice to the NACD is whether it talks about board diversity or whether it talks about the board's responsibility to oversee mission critical objectives, in the absence of clarity on the purpose of the company and the purpose of the board, you can wander around in the woods a long time without ever finding what it is that needs to happen and where you
Yeah.
need to go. So my point to the NACD is you've got this high-powered, incredibly pedigreed group assembled to look at a very clear question. Are board practices in the United States outdated? I applaud them. That's pretty clear. What's the integrity of a process that's going to examine whether practices are outdated in the absence of clarity on the purpose of the board? So, and I said, look, you can certainly have lots of long debates about things like diversity and whether the comp disclosure practices are fine or not fine, or whatever else you want to debate in great detail. And ESG can suck people into debates, and you forget about running the company. Well, they get confused about whether they've got the correct. But make no mistake about ESG. I like to simplify it. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. If you do not have any ESG objectives, you cannot have any ESG risks. I
Right.
can't say it any clearer than that. Now, a large percentage of companies do not have clear ESG objectives. So it goes back to my proposed purpose for a board is the board should be responsible for the purpose of the company and the supporting objectives, the value creation and value preservation objectives, and ESG objectives, and then I put comma, if any. So the board needs to decide, does the company have the appropriate ESG objectives, because it's the board's job to decide where each company lands on the shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism continuum.
And of course, it's going to be different for every company and every competitive context and industry in which they operate. I want to just kind of go over this hit list of what you think might be or is the things that that boards need to be focused on as part of this evolutionary process to getting refocused, finding a purpose, and restructuring. We think about supply chain operations and what we learned out of COVID, certainly with ESG, and even with the general way that supply chain risk needs to be accounted for. Now you've got tier 1, 2, 3 suppliers. You've got, within a lot of the climate change framework requirements, scopes 1, 2, and 3 responsibility, and what degree of reporting and clarity and accountability will be required for scopes 1, 2, and 3 from the SEC, for example, is currently under debate with the whole SEC revision to some of those rules. You've got human capital challenges. We've been talking about DEIB. Certainly cyber issues, ethics and compliance issues, fraud, corruption, anti-money laundering. I mean, those issues remain, especially for global entities. You've got challenges around leadership integrity. Have I hit them all? What am I missing?
You have, but in order to respond to your question, I have to put a clarification. In the United States, you are seeing, and I'm a litigation accountant by training, and I've sometimes represented boards accused of negligence. So board negligence is a real thing. Wells Fargo settled in the billions of dollars. Their board defense was that they didn't know. So we're talking about activities that went on for 15 years. Now, the SEC, the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, has levied fines of, I think it's like $30 million on the chief risk officer and a sizable amount on one or more of the chief audit executives in the organization. In the United States, you have an incredibly powerful, well-funded class action community that want to sue people, and the lawyers receive significant remuneration. Well, every time something goes seriously wrong, a potential target is the board of directors.
Right.
So given that, and they all have director and officer insurance, and they all usually have huge indemnities from the companies they represent to shield them from exposure. But if in fact the NACD believes that publicly disclosing the purpose of the board will make the individual personal exposure to being sued basically prohibitive, that nobody wants to serve on a board. So this is not a simple question. So in the absence of there being clear safe harbor provisions for boards that act in good faith, I follow all of the trends. And if you follow the Harvard governance blog, there are some incredibly good posts by some of the best law firms in the United States that represent, usually they're defendant type, meaning they don't represent the plaintiff, they represent the defendants, which is the companies and the boards. So there is a significant trend, and I won't bore you with all the details. There's a decision that was founded in the United States that's been the director protection standard called Caremark. It's slowly being eroded. What I mean by that, the Caremark decision said you can't sue a board unless you can prove they utterly failed. So that is the standard of conduct for boards in the United States. As long as they didn't utterly fail, just about anything above that bar is likely going to shield the board from liability. Now, that is being slowly eroded by the courts in the United States. And the courts are beginning to say, well, wait a minute, that's way too low a bar. So now they're starting to say mission critical objectives. If a board can't show they were overseeing those mission critical objectives, then we will hold them liable. Wells Fargo actually settled out of court so that this question wouldn't be aired.
Right.
I believe that. Now, this is an important question for society. You might quickly say, well, those boards are just avoiding responsibility. But think about it. We need good boards to oversee and help companies succeed. So they need to be shielded from unreasonable liability. But what they shouldn't be shielded from is responsibility to have reasonable processes that provide them with good, reliable information on the state of risk in the company and the risk-taking of the executives, including the CEO who run it. I don't believe most boards are saying to audit and risk functions, tell us what the state of risk / certainty we will achieve our most important objectives. Seems like a simple order to me, right?
Right.
They're not asking it. So audit departments give them 10, 15, 100, 300 internal audit reports, summarize it. The risk groups publish lists of top risks, send it to the board. The board reviews them, asks some questions. Tick on both fronts, okay?
Well,
That's what needs to change.
that's a very good point. And a lot of that checking the box is the same challenge that the ESG movement is having now, fully addressing risk factors by board directors, gets into culture, gets into function or dysfunction of the board itself as a unit. That's another whole subject. So maybe next time we'll have you come back and talk about some of the personal, cultural, functional dynamics that have to do with board directors themselves and what transformation has to occur in that area. TimLeech from Ontario, from Risk Oversight Solutions, great to have you. ArtStewart, Strategic Impact Partners, this is what matters most. Join us next time here on LinkedIn and YouTube.
Thanks, Art.